Here's a question. When do elder statesmen become elderly statesmen? Baby boomers have been running the United States for nearly 3 decades, more or less. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, they're all boomers. Only Joe Biden bucked the trend. He was born in 1942, so he's too old to be a boomer. So is now the time for the boomers and their elders to pass the political baton to a new generation? If so, to whom? Here's a breakdown of the generations in the United States. You've got the boomers on the left, followed by GenX, GenY, also known as the Millennials. Then comes Gen Z, also known as the Zoomers. And at the end are the young-uns, Gen Alpha. So let's look at Gen Z, which is starting to play a much more active role in politics. Some Gen Z-ers are already old enough to serve in Congress. And in less than 10 years, some of them will be eligible to run for president. Now, each generation is shaped by its experiences, such as technological change, wars, and economic shifts. So what sets Gen Z apart? Well, this is a generation that had its political awakening during the later years of America's war on terror, when US troops were still engaged in costly and unpopular conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Zoomers were in their teens during the COVID-19 pandemic, which arguably affected them most, with lockdowns, face masks, and social distancing at a time when they're trying to make social, when they're at their most social and trying to make their mark on social groups. They grew up and came of age online, glued to their screens, the first fully digital generation. Gen Z never knew a world without the internet and smartphones. Most recently, Zoomers have become the generation of protest. Gen Z students staged protests on campuses across the United States in opposition to the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. So let's look at how America's Gen Z sees the world and their country's place in it. Christopher Chivvis and Lauren Morganbesser are from the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They've been polling members of Gen Z. They have all the answers. Welcome both. Can I start with you, Lauren? I'm told you're a member of Gen Z, and if my maths is right, that puts you between 13 and 28 years old. Why should we be paying attention to this generation of voters now?
Yes, thank you so much for having me and Chris today. You're right, I am a member of Gen Z. I'm born in 2001, shortly after 9/11. But what motivated the study for us was that Gen Z is coming of age now. Its oldest members are now serving in Congress. In less than 10 years, we'll be eligible to run for the president. So as we become older and come of age, our views will only become more important. And we really wanted to know who this new generation is. What do they think? What is the impact of social media and the internet and the other new technologies that are impacting all of our lives, but no one more than Gen Z? So that's why we decided to do this study.
OK, Christopher Chivvis, just bounce us through a couple of the main takeaways.
Sure, delighted. I mean, as Lauren was saying, this is the generation that's really going to shape U.S. foreign policy in the mid-21st century, which is why it's so crucial that we understand what their views are on issues specific to today, like Ukraine or Israel or China, but also understand their broader views about things like the use of force in foreign affairs and what kind of a role the United States should play overall in the world itself. And so one of the most interesting things to me was that this is a pretty internationalist generation. Most of the Gen Zers who we polled want the United States to remain an active player in world affairs. But what's different about Gen Z from past generations is that they see that role as involving a little less use of military force, a little less important that the U.S. is #1 economy in the world, and also a little bit less concerned about promoting American democratic values overseas. So some similarities with the past, but also some interesting differences.
And so, Lauren, you're amongst this cohort. Does that ring true to you? You like to see the world, but you're not that big on America being everywhere all at once. And just tell me if that chimes with your experience.
For me, definitely growing up in kind of the post 9/11 period and seeing the effects of America's global war on terror has really had an impact on my generation. The failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, shows that US military force might not be the solution abroad, that democracy building might not be the perfect fit for every country around the world. So I think that's part of the rationale. And then as global conflicts from Israel to Ukraine start to impact both the world, but also my generation on college campuses, I think that rings more true than ever.
And so the 9/11 that had a big impact on you as you watched the news and watched this whole thing unfold over the years, did it?
I think not 9/11 itself, but the resulting conflicts
Right.
from that. I don't remember 9/11. I don't think anyone pretty much in my generation does. But I do remember the invasion of Iraq. I do remember the war in Afghanistan. And so I think that those are very resonant with my generation, whereas the attack itself was not as resonant. I think also the COVID-19 pandemic was very important. I started college during the pandemic, and it only accelerated the importance of technology and things like TikTok and Instagram to get news as we all turn to our screens.
Chris Chivvis, let's talk about that. So we've done 9/11. Let's talk about that next big thing, COVID. What did your polling tell you about its effect on this generation, this Gen Z?
Well, I mean, the area in which I think that we didn't ask any specific questions about COVID, but one of the related areas has to do with social media, which is obviously an important part of all of our COVID experience. And Gen Z, far more than any of the older generations in the U.S. right now, gets their international news, their information about foreign policy from social media and from conversations with friends. So there's actually a fair amount of skepticism about, I hate to say it on Deutsche Welle, but some of the big, well-known media outlets that are out there. It's not to say that Gen Z is not listening to Deutsche Welle or reading the New York Times. They are, but they do it with a little bit less confidence, maybe, than they do when they go on social media and hear stories about foreign affairs from their friends. So that's an important dimension that we have to recognize when it comes to this generation.
OK, so away from the actual statistics, just allow me to generalise. Does that perhaps explain why everything has become, or is that one of the explanations why so much of today's discourse has become so shouty? Gen Z, not necessarily looking at facts, but looking at TikTok and asking their friends. So when you drill down, so why do you believe that? The answer is because I saw it on the internet.
Yeah, I think there's some of that obviously going across all of American society, European society, many other societies around the world. And we did find that even though Gen Z differs from older generations in important ways, there's still a lot of polarization, political polarization within Gen Z. So, for example, we found that on a number of big issues like immigration, for example, there were divides within Gen Z that mirrored the broader divides in society. For example, with younger Republican voters being much more concerned about immigration and much more willing to use military force to combat immigration than their Gen Z Democrat counterparts. One big exception to this, though, was climate change, where we found that Gen Z Republican voters were far more concerned about climate change than older Republicans. This is something that is intuitive, but also, I think, potentially quite important to the future of U.S. foreign policy.
Lauren, talk to us about where Gen Z is on issues like the wars in Gaza and Ukraine.
Yes, for sure. So we specifically asked a lot of questions on the war in Gaza. So obviously it's been very resonant within my generation with widespread college protests, kind of at a level we haven't seen since the Vietnam War. But specifically what we were able to find is that nearly half of Gen Z-ers opposed U.S. military support to Israel. But even within this, like Chris was saying, there are clear partisan divides where Gen Z Harris voters were opposing military support to Israel, while most Gen Z Trump voters favored both defensive and offensive aid. We also asked a specific question about how close and how they felt to the plight of Palestinians and Israelis, how sympathetic they felt. And we found that young Gen Z Harris voters were more likely to feel sympathetic to Palestinians and Trump voters to Israelis. But notably, this was in lower numbers on the Republican side. So older Republicans felt more connected to Israelis than did young voters. And younger Gen Z voters were also more likely on the Harris camp and the Democrat camp to feel more connected to Palestinians. On Ukraine, we also found similar partisan divisions, although on Ukraine, they kind of stuck more to the partisan divides than to the generational divides.
And Chris, did you ask about China?
I think if I can just say we did. Let me make one point about Ukraine that's interesting to me, which is that younger Democrats were actually less supportive than older Democrats when it came to providing military assistance to Ukraine, notwithstanding the fact that the main divide was between Gen Z Dems and Gen Z Republicans.
Okay. China, is this a generation that sees China as America's number one enemy, like Presidents Trump and Biden?
On China,
really. That was something that surprised us. Go ahead, Lauren.
Yeah, as Chris was saying, that's something that surprised us, that Gen Z was not that concerned by China. They were 16 percentage points less likely to say it was very important for the U.S. to avoid a military conflict with China than the general public. They were also less concerned about certain issues like promoting human rights in China, kind of getting back to that democracy promotion element. That's not really a goal for them. They also were less concerned about maintaining a technological edge over China, which we were surprised by.
I wonder, I will give this one to you, Chris, where the value is in carving up generations like this when the world doesn't fit itself so neatly into these demographic boxes that we've created.
Sure. There's no question that generational snapshots like this only tell you part of the picture. But I think what's useful about generational analysis gets to what you and Lauren were talking about a few minutes ago, which is that most generations are shaped by a couple of key historical events, especially ones that occur fairly early in their consciousness as young adults. And those historical events can have a big impact on how they view the world throughout their lives and throughout their professional careers. Certainly we talk a lot about the Vietnam generation here in the United States and the impact that difficult experience had on the outlook of millions of Americans for decades afterwards. Now we have Gen Z, so we wanted to understand, what do they think about the world? And I think it's going to be really important. Obviously, we'll see it continue to unfold, but it's a story we want to keep watching.
All right, thanks for talking us through that to Christopher Chivvis and Lauren Morganbesser from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.